At breakfast, my wife mentioned Friday plans, but I saw a different message. This is the story of Oliver Grant and his wife, Chloe Bennett. They had built something most people would call a good marriage: steady, comfortable, arranged around routines that felt like love until you looked closely enough to see they were just routines. Oliver worked long hours and told himself it was for them, for the life they were building together. Even as that life quietly calcified around them both, Chloe had learned to fill the silence with productivity, with plans, with a version of herself that needed very little from him, and had spent years convincing herself that needing little was the same as being strong. What neither of them had said aloud, not once in 7 years, was that they had stopped truly seeing each other somewhere around year 4, and had been performing the marriage ever since with the quiet, desperate competence of people who were terrified of what stillness might reveal. This is a story about the lies we tell to protect people we're no longer sure we love, and about the strange, irreversible damage that protection can do. The coffee pot gurgled at 6:47 every morning, and Oliver had come to think of that sound as the truest constant in his life. Not a romantic thought, he knew, but there was something grounding in it. The mechanical faithfulness of a machine that did exactly what it promised, every single day, without ambiguity. Chloe was already at the kitchen island when he came downstairs, her reading glasses pushed up into her hair, a half-eaten piece of toast balanced on the edge of a plate she hadn't bothered to center. She was reading something on her phone, and she tilted the screen slightly, almost imperceptibly, when she heard his footsteps on the stairs. He noticed. He cataloged it the way he cataloged most things about her these days, quietly, without comment, storing it somewhere unexamined. "Morning," she said without looking up. "Morning." He poured his coffee and stood at the counter the way he always did, because somewhere along the years he had stopped sitting at breakfast, unless they had somewhere to be. He wasn't sure when that had happened. Outside, the October light was coming through the kitchen window at a low angle, catching the dust on the glass and making the whole room look slightly faded, like a photograph taken just a beat too late. He thought about mentioning it. The light looked strange today, and then didn't, because there was no real reason to. This was their marriage in its present form, competent, civil, organized around parallel silences. They had met at a conference in Portland 11 years ago. Oliver had been 31, presenting a paper on municipal infrastructure financing that he'd been convinced no one would read. Chloe had been in the third row, and she had asked the only question during the Q&A that showed she'd actually understood what he was arguing. He'd found her at the reception afterward. She'd been direct and funny and had a habit of looking at him like she was trying to figure something out. He had loved that about her for a long time. He wasn't sure when he had stopped finding it endearing and started finding it unnerving. "I've got a late one Thursday," he said now, because Thursdays had been their standing dinner night, a ritual they both preserved less out of desire and more out of a shared reluctance to officially abandon it. "Infrastructure review with the city council. Probably won't be home until 9. "That's fine." She turned a page or scrolled. He couldn't see which. "I have things to catch up on anyway." He nodded at his coffee cup. Their daughter, Nora, was at university in Edinburgh now, and Oliver sometimes thought her absence had removed the last natural subject they'd shared. Nora had been their connective tissue without either of them realizing it, the reason to coordinate, to compare notes, to speak to each other with warmth and a shared purpose. Now she called on Sunday evenings, and they each took the call separately from different rooms. And afterward, Oliver would hear Chloe laughing at something Nora had said, her voice carrying down the hall with a brightness he hadn't heard directed at him in a long time. "Lucas called yesterday," Chloe said, setting her phone face down on the island. Oliver looked up. "Your colleague Lucas? He wants to bring some consultants in on the Whitmore case. I might need to go in Saturday morning." "Sure." He finished his coffee, rinsed the mug, set it in the drying rack, because Chloe preferred air drying to the dishwasher for the good mugs, and he had internalized this preference so completely he no longer thought of it as a preference, just as the way things were done. Lucas Hayes had been Chloe's professional contact for about 2 years, a name Oliver had heard in passing, the way one hears most names in a spouse's working life, without texture or urgency. He was an attorney, Oliver knew, corporate or maybe estate law. He hadn't asked and Chloe hadn't elaborated, and that too was simply how things were between them now. Information offered in the minimum effective dose. He gathered his bag and his keys from the hook by the door. "Have a good day," he said. "You too." She had picked her phone back up. He was halfway to his car before he registered that she hadn't looked at him once during the entire conversation, and he stood for a moment in the driveway, the autumn air cold and smelling faintly of wood smoke from somewhere down the street, and tried to remember the last time she had. The thought didn't distress him exactly. It settled over him the way a dull ache settles, recognizable, familiar, not quite alarming enough to address. He got in the car and drove to work. That evening he came home to find the house quiet and dinner already put away in containers in the refrigerator, labeled with small pieces of masking tape and Chloe's neat handwriting. "Pasta, just reheat 3 min." He stood looking at the labels for a long moment. There was something in the gesture, the labeling, the anticipation of his lateness, the care without presence, that struck him as the most intimate thing she'd done for him in months. He ate alone at the kitchen island, reading a report he'd already read twice, and told himself this was fine, that this was what 7 years looked like, that contentment and distance weren't the same thing as unhappiness. He almost believed it. It was past 11 when his phone lit up on the counter. He wasn't trying to read her messages. The screen had simply caught his eye as he passed. Chloe had left her notifications visible, and the name at the top of the banner was Lucas Hayes, and the message beneath it read, "Friday can't come soon enough." Hamlet stood very still. The refrigerator hummed. The house held its breath around him. He picked up his phone and went upstairs to bed, and lay awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling with the particular quality of attention that arrives not when something breaks, but when something that has been bending for a long time finally shows you its angle. He didn't say anything the next morning, or the morning after that. This was a thing about Oliver that Chloe had once found steadying, and had more recently found maddening. He processed slowly, internally, with a thoroughness that meant by the time he spoke he had already arrived at a conclusion and was merely announcing it. She had told him once, during one of their last real arguments, a year ago maybe more, that talking to him sometimes felt like reading the last page of a book first. He hadn't known how to respond to that. He still didn't. He went about his week with the message sitting in him like a splinter. Present, specific. Impossible to forget and impossible to confirm. He reasoned with himself, a heart emoji and a casual phrase. It could mean anything. Lucas Hayes was her colleague. People sent messages like that. Colleagues had rhythms, shared anticipations, inside cadences that meant nothing beyond their professional context. He was not a jealous man. He had never been the type to surveil or demand, and he took a certain quiet pride in that, in the respect it implied, in the trust it demonstrated. And yet, Thursday evening, he sat across from Chloe at their dinner. She had come home early, which itself felt notable, and watched her the way he imagined he'd never watched her before, with the studied, slightly sick attention of a man looking for something he doesn't want to find. She was talking about a case, something about a client disputing an estate valuation, and her hands moved the way they always did when she was working through a problem, precise and slightly impatient, like her thoughts were moving faster than her words. She was still beautiful. He registered this with a dull surprise, as though he'd expected the suspicion to have rearranged her somehow. "You've been quiet," she said, not unkindly. "Tired," he said. She accepted this. She'd always been willing to accept reasonable explanations, which he'd once taken as trust, and now, watching her, wasn't sure how to categorize. "You should sleep more." She refilled his glass without asking. "You've been getting up at 5 again. I can hear you." "Sorry. I didn't say it was a problem. I just said I could hear you." There was a pause. Outside, a car moved slowly down their street, its headlights sliding across the wall. "Are things okay at work?" he asked. And the question was genuine, or at least half genuine, because work was the only container he had for what he wanted to ask. "Fine," she said. "Complicated, but fine." She looked at him with a brief, assessing quality, and he had the uncanny sensation that she was also measuring something, taking some kind of internal reading. Why, you seemed. He paused because he was doing the thing she hated, where he arrived at the end before explaining the middle. I don't know. Occupied. I'm always occupied. She said it without irritation, just as fact. More than usual. She considered this. Set her fork down. There's a lot happening with this case. I can't really talk about it. She said it like someone who had rehearsed saying it, which he noticed, which he added to the quiet accumulation. He nodded. He almost asked about Lucas Hayes then, felt the name right at the surface of his mouth, and swallowed it, because asking meant changing the shape of the evening, and he wasn't ready for what came after the question. I'll probably be late Friday, she said. Team dinner. Don't wait up. Team dinner. He looked at her face, looking for something that didn't belong. She was eating again, calm as always, her expression settled and composed. She had always been composed. It was one of the things he had loved about her, and one of the things that had, gradually, made him feel like he was standing on the wrong side of a glass. Sure, he said. Later, while she was loading the dishwasher, he found himself standing in the doorway watching her without meaning to, and there was something so practiced in her movements, so competent and self-contained, that he felt for the first time in a long time genuinely lonely. Not the background hum of two people living parallel lives, but something sharper. The loneliness of standing close to someone you used to know. She must have felt him looking because she turned. What? Not unkind, just the question. Nothing. He straightened, just. He stopped. She waited, her hands still. I don't know, he said. Maybe like subscribe or something. He blinked. Something flickered across his face. A brief, strange distance, like a man who looked up from a stage and glimpsed an audience he'd forgotten was there. He shook his head almost imperceptibly. Chloe stared at him for a moment. What does that mean? Nothing? Forget it, I'm tired? She looked at him a moment longer. That assessing look again, and then turned back to the dishwasher. Go to bed, Oliver. He went upstairs. He lay awake for a long time. On Friday morning, she kissed him on the cheek before she left. But she hadn't done in weeks, and that, more than anything, more than the message, more than the late nights, more than the face-down phone, unsettled him completely. It felt like a goodbye. He followed her. He had never done anything like it before, and the act of doing it, parking 2 blocks from their house, waiting, watching her silver car pull out at 5:40 on a Friday evening, felt so completely unlike him that he experienced it with a kind of detached unreality, as though he were observing someone else making the decision. He told himself he just wanted to know, that he wasn't the kind of person who could sit in an empty house with a story in his head and wait for her to come home smelling like the truth. He told himself it wasn't about distrust, but about resolution, and he was self-aware enough to know that was a distinction without much moral weight. She drove downtown. He stayed 3 cars back on streets he knew well. He'd spent 15 years working in city finance, and he knew this neighborhood block by block. She turned onto Mercer, then took the parking structure on 4th, and he pulled onto a side street and walked, hands in his coat pockets, feeling ridiculous. She walked half a block and turned into a building he knew by sight, Harding & Cole, a mid-sized legal firm that specialized in family and estate law. He stood on the opposite sidewalk and watched her push through the glass door and speak to someone at the front desk and disappear into an elevator. He stood there for a long time, not a restaurant, not a hotel bar, not someone's apartment, a law office. At 6 o'clock on a Friday evening, which meant someone had agreed to stay late, which meant this was not casual, he walked to a coffee shop around the corner and sat at a window table and ordered something he didn't drink, and tried to think clearly. Family law. The thought arrived fully formed, without drama, the way the worst realizations tend to arrive. Not as an explosion, but as a quiet, definitive click. He sat with it for 20 minutes before she emerged from the building, her coat buttoned against the October evening, her face composed and unreadable from across the street. She didn't look like a woman who just had a romantic meeting. She looked like a woman who had just done something she'd been steeling herself to do. He was home before her. He sat in the living room with the lamp on and no television. And when he heard her key in the door, he didn't move or call out, and she came down the hallway and stopped when she saw him. A long moment. "How was dinner?" he said. She looked at him. "It was fine." "Which restaurant?" Her chin lifted slightly. Not guilt. Something closer to resolve. "Oliver, I'm just asking." "You're not just asking." He held her gaze. The lamp made the room warm, amber, unreasonably cozy for what was happening in it. "I followed you," he said. "I know that was wrong. I'm not pretending otherwise." She set her bag down on the chair by the door, the way she always did. She didn't look shocked. She looked, if anything, like someone who had calculated for this possibility and had arrived at a response. "So you know," she said. "I know you were at Harding and Call." He watched her face. "Family law. Yes. How long?" She exhaled through her nose. 2 months, maybe 3. She moved to the armchair across from the sofa and sat, and they faced each other with the coffee table between them like a negotiating boundary. "I wasn't going to tell you yet. I wasn't ready." "For what exactly?" "Oliver." Her voice was careful, not cold. "I found the refinancing documents. In March. The Henderson account, the secondary lien on this house. I found all of it." The room changed. He heard his own breathing. "I didn't know how to ask you," she continued. "Every time I tried to start the conversation, you were either at work or tired, or I kept thinking you'd tell me yourself. I waited for months for you to tell me yourself." She pressed her hands flat on her knees, a gesture he recognized as her working to stay level. "And you didn't. So I needed to understand what our exposure was, legally, before I said anything." "The lien is being restructured," he said. "I've been working with the bank for 6 months. I didn't tell you because why?" He opened his mouth, closed it, because he'd been ashamed. Because he'd made a series of decisions 2 years ago when the consulting work had dried up and he'd needed to bridge a gap, and each decision had led to the next one. And the whole thing had compounded quietly while he'd been telling himself he'd have it resolved before she needed to know. Because he'd been protecting her, he told himself. And protecting her had looked, from the outside, exactly like lying. "Lucas Hayes," he said. "He's your lawyer. He's helping me understand my options." She looked at him steadily. "That's all it's been. The message, Friday can't come soon enough." Something moved across her face, understanding, and something adjacent to grief. "He uses that phrase. It's a scheduling thing between us." "I know how it looks." She paused. "That's why I didn't tell you I was seeing him. Not because of what it was. Because of how you'd read it before I could explain." He looked down at his hands. "Were you going to leave?" he asked. "I was trying to decide whether I needed to." The lamp hummed. The house was very quiet. "I'm not a villain in this," she said, and her voice cracked slightly, just at the end, the first fracture in the composure. "I was scared, Oliver. I've been scared for months, and you gave me nothing. I went somewhere I could get answers, because you weren't giving me any." He didn't argue. He sat with the weight of that, with the specific humiliation of recognizing that his protection had felt, to the person he was protecting, like abandonment. "I need some time," she said finally. He nodded. "Tonight I'm going to stay in the guest room." He nodded again. She stood, picked up her bag, walked down the hallway. He heard the guest room door close, not loudly, with a kind of careful, deliberate quiet that was somehow worse than a slam. He sat alone in the amber light for a very long time and thought about all the things he should have said, and when, and to whom, the winter arrived the way it always did in that city. Not suddenly, but persistently. The light retreating a few minutes at a time until one morning Oliver woke to true darkness at 7 and realized November had finished without his noticing. They had not separated. This surprised people he gathered. The few people who knew anything, which was only his friend Marcus, who had heard just enough to form a concerned expression that he wore whenever Oliver's marriage came up and never quite managed to hide. They had not separated. but they had reorganized. Chloe slept in the guest room 2 or 3 nights a week. They ate breakfast at different times. They were unfailingly polite in a way that was its own form of distance. The debt restructuring had been disclosed in full. Oliver had sat across from Chloe and a different lawyer, not Lucas Hayes, someone she brought in separately, and laid out every document, every refinancing agreement, every number. It had taken 3 hours. At the end, Chloe had thanked the lawyer and said she'd be in touch. And in the car on the way home, she had stared out the passenger window and said nothing. And he had not been able to tell whether her silence was anger or grief, or some combination that had no clean name. He had started therapy in October, mostly because Marcus had suggested it with the careful, non-pushy tone of someone who'd been waiting a long time to suggest it. His therapist was a quiet woman named Dr. Ellison, who had a habit of waiting several beats after he stopped speaking before responding, which he found against his expectations clarifying. He had spent the first 4 sessions explaining his marriage in a way that was really, he gradually came to understand, explaining himself, his silences, his protections, his deep, structural conviction that managing a problem alone was a form of love. What were you afraid she'd do? Dr. Ellison had asked in the 5th session. He hadn't had a quick answer for that. He'd thought about it for 2 weeks, and what he arrived at was something he hadn't let himself look at directly. He had been afraid she'd decide he wasn't worth the trouble, that the version of Oliver Grant she'd married, capable, steady, the man with the infrastructure paper she'd asked the smart question about, would be revealed as insufficient, and she would leave. Not because of the debt, but because of the man the debt revealed. He told Dr. Ellison this, and she wrote something down, and he felt the strange, uncomfortable relief of having said a true thing to someone. Chloe, he knew, was doing her own version of this accounting, though she did it privately, in the way she did most things, alone, methodically, without visible distress. He would sometimes catch her in the kitchen in the evenings reading something on her phone with an expression of focused concentration, and he understood she was educating herself, processing, building a framework she could trust. It was so recognizably her that it ached. They were both, he thought, people who had spent their marriage protecting each other from the full truth of themselves. And they had done it so competently, so considerately, that neither of them had noticed until the protections started looking like walls. Nora called on a Sunday in December and at some point said, with the directness of a young woman who'd lived away long enough to see her parents clearly, "Are you two okay? You both seem managed." Oliver had said they were going through some things, and Nora had been quiet for a moment and then said, "I know it's not my business, but I hope you figure it out." He'd sat with the phone after she hung up and felt something open in his chest, briefly, like a window. Lucas Hayes, he had learned, had moved firms in November. Chloe mentioned it once, offhandedly, in a way that was probably designed to close that particular chapter cleanly. Oliver appreciated the gesture and found he didn't have strong feelings about Lucas Hayes anymore. Not absolution exactly, but something like irrelevance. The man had been a cipher, an ink blot onto which Oliver had projected a specific fear, and the fear hadn't been about Lucas at all. It had been about himself. He had been hiding something, not a betrayal, not a cruelty, but something. And some part of him, the part that had seen the message on Chloe's phone and felt it land with that cold, specific weight, had known it. January arrived. He came home one evening to find Chloe at the kitchen island, not reading, not on her phone, just sitting with a cup of tea, her reading glasses off, her hair pulled back in a way that made her look tired and younger simultaneously. She looked up when he came in. "I made enough pasta," she said. "If you want some." He hung up his coat. "I'd like that." They ate at the kitchen island, side by side, which was something they hadn't done in months. She told him about a case, something tedious and procedural, and he listened and asked a question, and she answered it, and neither of them said anything that felt like progress. Exactly. But there was something different in the quality of the silence between sentences. Less performance in it. Something closer to actual rest. He didn't know if they were going to be all right. He thought he was finally, genuinely prepared for either possibility. That felt like the most honest thing he'd arrived at in years. Spring came late. March had been relentlessly gray, and then one morning in early April, Oliver walked outside to find that the maple in their front yard had started, tentatively, improbably, to bud. He stood looking at it for a moment before getting in his car, the way he sometimes stood looking at the kitchen window light when it was particular and caught something. Taking inventory, Chloe had signed the lease on an apartment. She told him 2 weeks ago on a Tuesday evening, sitting at the kitchen island with her hands folded on the surface. And she'd told him the way she told him most things now, directly, with care, without editorial. It was a 2-bedroom in the Westmore building on the other side of the park. She'd be moving in May. He had said, okay. She had looked at him for a moment, and something in her expression had shifted slightly. Surprised, maybe, at the absence of protest, or at what it indicated. "Are you all right?" "I think so," he'd said, and meant it, which surprised them both. They had continued their process through the winter with Harding and Call, the dissolution documents, the practical restructuring of a life shared across 7 years. Oliver had brought his own lawyer. They had been careful and fair with each other in the way you can only be with someone who knows you well enough to know where the soft places are and has decided not to use them. It was strange, he thought, how much more present they had been with each other in these 6 months of ending than they had been in perhaps the last 2 years of the marriage itself. There was a kind of terrible clarity and removal, in the stripping away of the performance. They had talked more honestly since October than they had in years. On the last Saturday in April, they met at the house to divide the remaining items, the things not covered in the formal agreement, the small accumulated objects of a long shared life, a bookshelf they bought at an estate sale in Vermont, a set of copper pots from her grandmother, a print they purchased on their 3rd anniversary in Madrid, which they both paused in front of for a moment before she said, "You should keep it." And he said, "Are you sure?" And she said, "Yes," and that was that. They worked through the afternoon, mostly quiet, occasionally negotiating, sometimes pausing when an object surfaced from some forgotten stratum of their shared history. He found a box of photographs from their first apartment, actual printed photographs, which seemed like another era, and brought it out to where she was packing in the dining room. "These are mostly yours," he said, setting the box on the table. She looked through them slowly. He watched her face move through something, some private catalogue of feeling, and didn't try to read it. "Look at us," she said quietly, and held up a photograph he recognized. A beach somewhere in Oregon, the two of them squinting into the light, her hand shading her eyes, his arm around her shoulders. They looked so genuinely happy that he felt something shift in him. Not regret exactly, but something adjacent to it. Something like grief for a version of themselves that had been real before they buried it under competence and silence, and the accumulated habits of two people who had stopped asking each other for things. "We were good," he said. She held the photograph for another moment and then placed it carefully back in the box. "We were." She closed the flaps. "We were also not quite honest enough with each other, with ourselves." He didn't disagree. She set the box to one side and turned to face him, and there was something in the way she looked at him. Not with warmth exactly, and not with the managed distance they'd maintained for months, but with something more like full attention, the kind she'd had in that 3rd row in Portland when she was trying to figure him out. "I don't think you're a bad person, Oliver," she said. "I want to say that clearly." "I don't think you are either." He paused. "I should have said things earlier. A lot of things. So should I." The afternoon light was coming through the dining room windows at that low, particular angle, and she looked, in it, very much like the woman he had stood next to 11 years ago and thought he understood, and he felt the full, absurd weight of how much they had missed each other, how continuously, without either of them quite intending it. "I hope you'll be happy," he said. The words were simple, and he meant them without reservation. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up the box and her coat from the chair and her bag. "I think we both might be," she said, "eventually." She walked down the hallway. He heard the front door open and pause and then close, with care, with that same deliberate quiet that had characterized the worst and best moments of their marriage. He stood alone in the dining room with the light and the empty table and the slight residue of a life that had been, for a long time, good, and then had been for a long time quiet, and then had been, briefly and painfully, honest. He thought about what Dr. Ellison had said in their last session, that the goal wasn't to stop feeling the weight of what he'd lost, but to carry it without letting it be the only thing he carried. He looked at the print on the wall, the Madrid print she'd left him, and thought that was probably right. He went to the kitchen and put the kettle on. The maple in the front yard was still budding. Outside, the afternoon moved on without asking permission, the way afternoons do.